Hello, mentors. Welcome to meeting 4, Palabras More, Palabras Less. Let's create and analyze data about translations and lengths of words. So this was February 5th of winter 2025. And this meeting has two parts. The first is called lengths of words. The second, after the break, it's called Let's Read Tagalog. So what is this meeting about? It's about percentages and finding and using scaling factors, also interpreting data, graphs, namely dot plots, and trend lines that summarize some data. And then what is it about in the real world? Well, it's about world languages, learning about new languages and sharing, also cultural exchanges, and teaching language to others. So you could think of it as a celebration of languages in the sense that you're learning, but also teaching a lot. Which languages we're considering? Pretty much all languages are good to bring to the table, but specifically we'll have English, Spanish, and then in part 2, Tagalog from the Philippines, which is a main language from there. So how to break it down? Well, for the first part, lengths of words, we'll start with an introduction. Then we'll work on a big activity called translate. And then finally, some kind of puzzle or application problem that's 10 minutes called translation machines. That if you don't do it in 10 minutes, you could probably do it in less, more like explaining or summarizing. So you could use it in many different ways. So as it's usually in many of the meetings, we put this last part as a flexible because we know that as mentors, as teachers, of course, things may not go as planned and you need some flexibility to use your resources. So, I mean, from skipping altogether and leave as homework up to really go over it in detail and even a little bit in part 2. Let's take a look on this page, part 1, how it looks like. You first start with some basic open questions about languages. Which languages do you speak, even slightly? Which you want to learn? Longest word. This is important because we'll focus on lengths of words. So this starts introducing the mathematical objects. Where in the world is Spanish spoken? So which countries in Latin America and beyond Latin America, or which other continents or countries speak. So this is a nice part, and students will actually have a map of this part of America. And finally, comparing English and Spanish, which words are usually longer, how much longer? So this question is the one that enables us to transition into the second part. English students will translate words, find scaling factors. So it's not about how many more letters, but the relative growth, right? Does it double, triples, or multiply by what? So it's a relative scaling. So here it grew by 1 letter, but we don't care about that. We care about relative to the size of 4. This is now 25% more. So it's a big change, but I mean, small, absolute, just 1 letter, but relative, it's big change. So it accumulates, right? When you translate, I mean, you just translate milk, no worries, you just need 1 more letter. But if you're translating all over and this factor, it's 25%, then you have to do much more letters, right? So it takes longer to write in Spanish in that sense. We also stress out a lot about mentally finding these percentages. So play a lot with that. You can also use these diagrams, of course, which are just there, right? So you could visualize how this is 1/4 more, but also mentally, it's going to be important. Then we go to this analysis and just we have these 5 questions that blend together very nicely. So the first is just open, analyzing what happened here in many different ways. Then these 2 are concrete problems on translating, kind of applying this data or the rules that students discovered to what happens when we translate to English and to Spanish. So here to Spanish and here to English. And then these questions are kind of follow-ups, but more formal, in which we actually now want to press students to give us a scaling factor. 1, just 1, because here they have a lot, but just 1. Here the same in reverse, and then you go back to A and B, because now with this information, you can revisit this and do a more in-depth, more rounded conclusion to this, how you use the scaling factor. After that, the translation machines. So we have these new languages. So we forget about Spanish here, and we have these new languages that will go through English to build a cool machine to do something. We also talk about scaling factors here. So it's really important that students really get that concept. Here they apply it. That's part one. After the break, so as we said, machines is optional and can be skipped or used as a quick closure if you're short on time. You know your students, you know what works and the trends and tendencies, so you'll be able to anticipate how to use this part in a very efficient and useful way. Okay, so part two, let's read Tagalog. So what students will do is first, what is Tagalog? So this takes 5 minutes. It could maybe extend a little bit more, maybe 7 or so. There's going to be a quick game and then analyzing data. So we jump into another case in which the data is already given. Here it was built through translations in a fun little game or activity of translations. But here, all the translations are given. But this language, it's unfamiliar. So it has a very different flavor. So for the first part about what is Tagalog, so yeah, you talk a little bit about the influence with Spanish. You give them some things to guess. For example, ¿Cómo está? They could guess, hopefully, that it's ¿Cómo está?, which is how are you? Some are maybe easier, maybe, I don't know. Silja is silla, and cuchara really sounds like cuchara, spoon. Some are harder. Mantica is manteca, cooking oil. This is breakfast in the sense of almuerzo, almurzar. And some are, well, not connected necessarily to Spanish, salamat and palam. After that, you maybe ask questions about why they think that the influence from Spanish, and maybe talk a little bit about the history of it. Not much, just quickly. And then you have these facts that you could introduce or, I guess, integrate in the discussion. After that, you jump to part two, which is called Let's Read Tagalog. So we're giving students two pieces of information that are very different in form and are not totally equivalent, but one is kind of the flip side of the other one. Okay, this has no words, but it has the lengths of the words in English and Tagalog. We don't tell which is which, and you may have to guide them to make sense of this through questions. What's going to happen is that if the length in one language is 10, for example, here, then when you translate to the other language, in some fixed translation, the length jumps to 14, 15 here. They have to make sense of this and answer these questions. How they're going to do that? Well, they have this help, which is the list of words in English and phrases and the list of the translations. But here's the catch. These don't go in the corresponding order. For example, a black dolphin, which is this number 7, doesn't translate necessarily into T7. It actually will translate into, well, you can guess, T8. Which brings us, so yeah, somebody kind of sorted this by length and destroyed the matching that was in the translations. So students will need to match this. How do they do it? How do they do it? Well, knowing Spanish helps. Knowing some structures, like being detectives, helps. But then also using this will help. For example, here they could say that the dot, right, this data point of 3140 corresponds to length. So they look for 3140 here and they see here and here. And they'll just be able to match. It works, but not necessarily for all cases, and you'll figure out why. So it's nice because to fill this axis, they need this. And to match this, they also need this kind of circular. But well, I guess that's life. You have pieces of information and you're trying to make sense of them kind of together, going at the same time, back and forth. So that should take, yeah, about 15 to 20 minutes, this kind of game. And I guess the hint here is that if they take it too long on this and really stuck, you just give them some key translations. For example, you could give them the translation, say, hey, I'm going to give you the translation of kainin or kanapa, panavik. I don't know, whichever you feel. So you need to prepare really well and be able to solve these many times to see which paths work and which paths don't work. And of course, let them struggle and work in teams. Teams, of course, will be faster because some students may discover some facts and then relate them to the others' facts. And I also want to say that it's not just doing detective work here in abstract, but you're also learning about this data representation because you have to use it. So you're really going to be tested if you are using it to understand what each point means in able to use it for this match. So it's a necessity. It is a necessity so that's why this puzzle, don't just skip it, but make sure that it goes through this. We also conclude with scaling factor. So it's the same question as in part 1, where we looked for an ideal average representative scaling factor that summarize what happens to the lengths when you go from one language to another one. And yeah, it's going to be longer, Tagalog also, in general, than English. You also will discuss why. Finally, trend lines. Yeah, you don't have to use that fancy language of a line of best fit, or you don't have to, of course, compute it using the formulas that we know from statistics or so. But it is very intuitive that the line should probably go to 0, because if the length is 0 in one language, it's just saying nothing. So you just say nothing again. So that's something that students should point out. And then, of course, the line cannot go like this far or this far. It has to go kind of this. And then they calibrate it to see exactly what happens. This is kind of an outlier, so you could also discuss that. And other than that, the correlation or the association between the lengths seems pretty organized, pretty predictable. Of course, we chose phrases that would not have too many outliers just to simplify the activity. So that's it. I hope you have a lot of fun in this meeting, and see you in another video. Goodbye.